الاقتصادية للتحولات المعاصرة، آفاق وتطلعات. ونبدأ معكم الآن جلسة لصندوق النقد الدولي بعنوان نظرة صندوق النقد الدولي للاقتصاد السعودي. يسعدنا في هذه الجلسة أن نستضيف شخصية اقتصادية بارزة من صندوق النقد الدولي، حيث يشاركنا بخبرته وتحليلاته العميقة حول الاقتصاد السعودي وآفاقه المستقبلية. ويدير الجلسة سعادة الدكتور سعيد الشيخ، مدير عام مركز الدراسات والاستشارات بجامعة الأعمال والتكنولوجيا، وعضو مجلس الشورى السابق. Dear esteemed guests, we welcome you to the second day of the 22nd Annual Scientific Conference of the Saudi Economic Association, held under the theme, The Economic Impacts of Contemporary Transformations, Prospects and Aspirations. We hope you have enjoyed and benefited from the sessions and interactive workshops presented so far, and we are pleased to welcome you once again. We now begin a special session by the International Monetary Fund, IMF, entitled The IMF's Perspective on the Saudi Economy. It's our pleasure today to welcome a distinguished guest from the International Monetary Fund, who will share with us his insights and analysis of the Saudi economy and its future outlook. The session will be moderated by Dr. Saeed al-Sheikh, Director General of the Center for Studies and Consultations at the University of Business and Technology and former Shura Council.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mati, the IMF's mission chief for Saudi Arabia, who led the team behind the 2025 Article 4 consultation report. Amin Mati is Assistant Director in the IMF Middle East and Central Asia Department. Since January 2022, he has been the IMF's mission chief for Saudi Arabia and head of the IMF's GCC division. Prior to this role, Mr. Mati was the IMF senior resident representative and mission chief for Nigeria, leading and managing the IMF country work there, including the COVID-19 IMF emergency financial assistance. Article 4 consultation is an annual assessment that provides critical insights into the kingdom's macroeconomic outlook, fiscal sustainability, structural reforms, and the progress of Vision 2030. We are fortunate to have with us through online to share reflection on the findings and implication of the report, Mr. Mati. Mr. Mati, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Assalamu alaikum, Jamian. Good to see everybody. Thank you for having me for your conference. I think I was reserved like 2 months ago. They told me you have to attend, so very happy that we're able to make this work and present some of the Article 4 results. This is, as Dr. said, this is our IMF annual evaluation. Our staff report is out. I'm gonna try to go quickly over some slides so that we can do that around 15 minutes and then leave time for discussion after that. So let me first share the slides, and do you see them?
Yes.
All right. So, let me first see the context about where is Saudi Arabia coming from. And you see here in the slides, a lot of progress has been done under Vision 2030 in terms of the structural reforms. You've seen an acceleration, a number of laws, whether it's foreign investment code, more recently, the bankruptcy laws in the past, commercial transaction law, a lot of them to try to really ease the regulatory burden and try to ease entry of firms to really enhance private sector. There's always some targets that were set. We've seen a lot of progress. Female labor force participation, for example, is one. Number of tourism visitors already exceeding the 2030 target. Non-oil government revenue, quite an increase, it tripled, but of course there's still quite a lot to reach the target. Same on the SME loans, which still remains lower than 20% target. Home ownership rate is close to the 70% target at 60-70%. But overall, if you were to look at it, and the country well, you are there, you are studying it, there has been progress. We look at around decades, the country's dependence on oil still remains high, but has been reduced. We've seen that in the national accounts. We've seen that in revenues where they are now, oil is less than 60% of total. And we are seeing that in exports, although it's still quite high. Now, what are we seeing in terms of growth? 2024, we've seen that the real GDP growth it has remained robust, particularly if we were to look at it in terms of non-oil GDP, that is at 4.5%, 4%. And this is despite a number of shocks that has happened. And you see that some of our targets have been revised because of what is happening with OPEC Plus and the oil production cuts that keep being unwinded at a more accelerated pace. Unemployment is at a record low and keeps improving. This stops at December 2024. We can look at Q1 numbers. We are now at 6.3%. These are the lowest numbers Saudi Arabia has seen. And this is, before, when we were talking about some of these trends, people were saying, okay, this is coming from the government. Well, not necessarily. If you look at what has happened from 2018, a large share of the increase in the Saudi economy has been coming from the private sector, no longer the government as the primary choice for creating jobs. Now, what has supported growth? Private investment, non-oil private investment remains high, growth at about 6% last year. It was double digits the year before. This is not just the giga projects, but it's just, a lot of the projects for the economy to diversify. We've seen a lot of the growth in the retail and services sector. We've also seen that the recent GDP rebasing, which we had looked at, had pushed up GDP. And because the methodology was redone, after a long time, it's not unusual to find such large revisions, but we've seen now nominal GDP up by 14%, non-oil GDP up by 27%. So quite a lot of revisions that moved the numbers on GDP. And throughout, inflation has been quite stable, actually remarkably stable, close to 2% or lower. All of the geopolitical shocks, all of the different shocks have, even post-COVID, when you have seen wholesale prices moving up by 14, 50% or more, we haven't seen such impact on inflation. Actually, that has remained quite muted, including because of the monetary policy, the peg, and the strength of the dollar at some point during the past 2 years. So now that seems to be reversing. Now, at the same time, remember I said that we have investment that's keeping up growth, but investment also means that there have been some more imports coming in. there has been more growth in the economy, which also means more imports. We've also seen that the oil price that had reached record high in 2022 has also decreased. Last year was averaging around $80. It's still solid oil price. And at the same time, remember, we had the OPEC oil production cuts, which has reduced production to 9 million barrels a day for Saudi Arabia. All of that led to lower revenue, lower export proceeds, but also higher imports. And that translated into a twin deficit, both current account deficit and a fiscal deficit. And these will have to be financed, and we will come to that in a little bit. Still, external buffers are quite comfortable, quite strong. Reserve adequacy is higher than 150% recommended. If we were to look at import coverage, 15, 16 months. So this is quite comfortable situation. And, I talked about the fiscal deficit that has reached 2.3% of GDP. If we were to look at the central government debt, it's still low. If you look at 2024, it's 26%. If we were to look at net debt, let's say just take away the central government deposits at the central bank, it's only 16%. So by any measure or metric in terms of sustainability, this is still quite low with a lot of space available. On the banking side, remember I talked about corporate growth. Corporate growth also needs financing. And the banks need to finance that. Deposit growth, a lot of the banks were really deposit-based system. And a lot of the growth through deposits is just not enough to meet the demand. So what have banks done? Diversified their funding base by going outside. So they borrow more externally. And this is why you've seen that net foreign assets have turned negative for the first time since 1993. And we're seeing the loan to deposit ratio going way above 100%, right? So in other words, banks are very happy expanding their loan. It's corporate, not just retail. It's not just mortgage. Actually, mortgage lending has now moderated. But to do that, they need to find how to source it, how to finance it. They're giving time and saving deposits have grown, which means they have to pay interest on that. This is now 30-35% of deposits. The share of public sector deposits have grown, but even that is not enough. And they have to go abroad, either through borrowing long-term or even short-term certificates of deposits. At some point, that funding pressure we've seen manifested itself in the rates when you look at the SIBOR so far spreads that are recorded here, which are now staying at between 120 and 140 basis points. Sorry. Now, on the outlook, this is what I'm presenting here is not our latest, which is going to come in October when we have our World Economic Outlook that's going to come out. And the reason I say this is that what you are seeing here in terms of oil production reflects the unwinding as announced by OPEC in July. Since then, we have much more unwinding on the oil production cut. In September, we already are 10 million barrels a day. You've seen last September 7th, there's the second OPEC plus unwinding, the second tranche of 1.65 million barrels a day. That's going to add also another 500,000 barrels to Saudi Arabia's production throughout. And that's going to be, the idea is that if that's going to be unwind, this is going to be bringing forward the production compared to the estimates that you're seeing here. And even with this, you see that, we do expect growth to be quite robust, above 3.7% in terms of non-oil. The impact, we've been asked a lot about tariffs and the impact on tariffs and how do we see that on the outlook. Very minimal for Saudi Arabia. A lot of the, first of all, in terms of the trade with the US, if we were to look at non-oil exports, it's very small. like less than $4 billion. A lot of it and the trade in terms of hydrocarbon products have been exempted. So the impact, we're not seeing much of an impact on that, and you clearly see it here. Actually, if you were to look just at the non-oil trade balance, we're looking at the deficit. If we were to look at what we are projecting, we're still projecting that investment will be contributed to growth. Remember, going forward, we still are expecting a number of events to happen, from the Asia Games to the World Expo to the World Cup. Some of those infrastructure projects will need to happen. At the same time, there's a number of Vision 2030 plans that will still need to happen. I know there's been reprioritization, recalibration. What is important is that the outcome of that be announced so that investors can plan, right? If there is uncertainty about what projects are continuing, there's going to be a wait and see attitude by some of those investors. So it is important to know what is the new reprioritization, if there is one, what is the new recalibration, just so that this is clear for all. Now, these are some of the projections. I won't bore you with that. These are some of the numbers. You see that in our report. I know people like to look at the real GDP growth rate. We have going to 3.9% and going forward. This is still under conservative assumption on investment. If there's this implementation of reform that accelerates, if there's higher production output, we're going to be seeing higher growth. Of course, on the downside, if we have weaker oil demand and lower spending, that's going to put also a dampener on growth. And in the report, if you look at it, what we've done is that, there's a lot of talk these days about oil price. Well, first, for Saudi Arabia, we have oil production that went up. But we did a scenario where we say, okay, let's imagine that oil price goes down to $40 a barrel. What would be the impact for Saudi Arabia? Well, the deficit goes up, fiscal, no surprise. The current account goes up. But, we don't expect this shock to be permanent. And even then, if you were just to look at central government deposits held at the central bank, these are 9% of GDP. So what we're saying is that even in such a scenario, there's probably not a need to adjust as much as people are thinking. And there's no need to, because there are buffers that are there to try to smooth the shock and avoid a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. And if you look at one of the annexes in our report, we go through different scenarios there. So going forward, what are our recommendations? And I'm aware of time. I'll try to finish all of this in 5 minutes. One, on fiscal. For 2025, we do expect the deficit to be higher than budgeted. Our current projection is 4% versus the authority's 2.3% of GDP. But oil prices are around, let's say at $66, $67. They're lower than $80 of last year. It doesn't mean that there needs to be any more adjustment. We actually believe that there have been already enough adjustment when we look at the non-oil primary balance. And therefore, our recommendation is that for 2025, let's not engage in a pro-cyclical fiscal policy. Remember, that was one of the pitfalls of the past. Oil price went down, spending was cut, growth is hurt, right? So the idea is, let's preserve what are our medium-term plans and see how we can finance that spending and realize those. And so avoiding this fiscal discipline, avoiding the pro-cyclical fiscal policy is important while maintaining prudent fiscal policy. That doesn't mean that going forward, as you try to reach intergenerational equity, it doesn't mean that it is not important to continue some gradual fiscal adjustment. And we think, for the next 5 years, an adjustment of 3.5–4% of GDP, of non-oil GDP is important. How to get there? Remember at the beginning, I said that there's been a lot of progress on non-oil revenues. VAT, the revenue administration's measures to improve efficiency, And we think there's probably a lot more room. If we were to look at the tax gap, if we were to look at the difference in terms of taxes with the G20, there's 10% to 15% tax gap. So there's a lot of revenues there, whether it is property tax, reforming corporate tax, removing the exemptions, all of this is there. And I know there's always, talk about incentives are good and this is how we're going to get businesses. But if you were to look at any of the enterprise surveys, and if you were to look at the top 3 drivers of what is it that will improve growth, taxation doesn't come in the top 5, right? In the top 3, you have labor, you have access to finance, access to land, but there's nothing about taxation level being an issue, right? So I think something to think about. Obviously, something that I know generates a lot of attention when we talk about it. IMF talks about energy subsidy again. Reason is that these are inefficient. Energy subsidies for Saudi Arabia, this is basically the foregone revenue for Aramco, which Aramco reports in its financial statements. You could have gotten the extra revenue, spent it on some targeted social safety nets. You have some very, where the demand program is actually quite targeted, and decide to help the population that is most affected. Otherwise, a lot of these subsidies, a lot of these, lower oil price than international, means that people with big cars, people that can afford it, have 2-3 cars, are all benefiting from this. It is actually quite inefficient and regressive way of support. There's also quite a lot that can be done on the to strengthen the fiscal institutions, and the report goes through quite a lot, including fiscal rule, and I'm happy to talk about that. Let me talk about monetary and financial sector policy. Remember, I talked about the peg. The peg remains appropriate. That's the anchor. Then on the financial sector, there's a lot of progress. The financial sector is in a good position. You have solvency ratios that are above 19%. You have NPLs at record low. But we have this funding, pressure that starts to manifest itself. Banks want to increase loans. And it's important going forward to try to limit the risks and try to anticipate. This is what SAMA has done more recently by introducing a countercyclical capital buffer. This is why it's important to look at macroprudential. You want to avoid the exposure to short-term flows. A lot of the banks now are going to these short-term certificates of deposits from abroad. What happens if there's a reversal, right? These are some of the risks that the banks will have to look at, and it's important to monitor that, and also exposure to loans. Now, this is the last part. I'm going to go very quickly just to reiterate. A lot has been done on structural reforms. Saudi Arabia, you see the left-hand chart, the closer you are to the center, the more progress you've done. And clearly you see how the red line has gotten closer on business regulation, credit market, labor market, governance. All of that is much more improved than 2015, 22, or even, and the progress keeps going. There's a lot of laws and regulations that have been passed. The progress, we believe that structural reforms and the progress there has contributed to the performance of Saudi Arabia, and the reason why the economy has remained resilient. Obviously, there's still areas to do more. Even after all this progress, perception is still there. FDI is increasing, and we've seen record numbers, but it's still not where the kingdom wants to see it. This is still below the target, and I think this is one area that keeps coming back is human capital. This is where you guys are. We are at the university. You are training the next generation, and really human capital is key for growth going forward. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to go through questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. And you touch on key issues of importance. And I would like to raise few questions, so you delve into more details regarding some of the areas you touched on. Maybe I will start with what are the external risks, whether geopolitical, financial, or energy related, that could challenge the kingdom's trajectory, and how resilient is the Saudi economy to these shocks?
Look, I mean, I talked about some of these. Clearly, if production is affected, whether it's through cuts or something else, whether so if there's weaker demand and then there's a collapse in oil prices, that would affect the Saudi economy. Less than before, because remember now the procyclicality or the link between oil revenue or oil proceeds and the economy is a bit weaker, but it will still affect the Saudi economy. But there are quite a lot of buffers that make it resilient. Hence the idea of, if there is such a shock, I mean, at least as a short-term response, it would be important to try to use the buffers to alleviate the impact and try to protect growth. There's quite a lot of projects. There's a medium-term fiscal framework that is envisaging some of the projects under Vision 2030. It's important to continue these so that growth is maintained. Geopolitical risk, it depends on how that will materialize. I see a lot of these really coming back through the oil channel, and I think this is really how the economy is. I think that's why it's important, and that's a recommendation that we keep making, that no matter what happens to the fluctuations in oil price, the reform momentum and the progress on structural reforms should continue.
Excellent points. You touched through the presentation on the growth of the non-oil sector. And certainly private sector is very important for the future growth of Saudi Arabia through 2030. Which areas private sector reform do you see as most critical to sustaining diversification and ensuring stronger growth of the non-oil sector?
Look, I think we are seeing growth. We saw some of the growth in construction, we saw retail, we saw services, and we want to see investment in sectors that are allowing Saudi Arabia to move up through the value chain and to go through more sophisticated products, be able to export. To do that, FDI would be needed. To do that, I think continuing on the impressive regulatory reforms that were done. I talked about the investment code, the commercial transaction code, the civil code, etc. And it's important that implementation remains there, because you need to provide certainty to the investors so that the perception of the past, or that, oh, it's difficult to do business in Saudi, are completely wiped out, because Saudi Arabia today has really done an impressive amount of reforms, and implementation would be important for it to support growth. I still expect investment to be a big contributor to growth, as well as consumption coming from some of the retail services. This is why you are seeing non-oil private sector activities growing by 4% or more, and that needs to continue going forward.
Indeed, private sector dynamism is vital. Let me move to an area you already touched on, which is the lower employment. How does the IMF evaluate the progress of labor market reforms, particularly with regard to youth and female participation, and the alignment of education with the skills demanded by the private sector?
I mean, look, the progress has been quite impressive. I think, in 2016, when some of those targets were met, when people were saying, 30% female labor force participation by 2030, it was still judged ambitious. Here we are today, already in 22, 23, the 30% target was already surpassed and went from 16 to 34, 35%. Today we are at 37%. Youth unemployment has been halved. We are now seeing record levels in terms of, so this has happened also, and not at the expense of male labor force or male unemployment. This has happened because the pie in the economy has grown larger. So the economy is growing. A lot of the new opportunities are coming from the private sector. There are new industries, there are new sectors that did not exist before. Of course, there are still these targets and sector thresholds. In some cases, there was some concerns initially. I think now they are becoming less binding in some areas. I think that's one area to look at. I think, you talked about the curriculum. I think it's quite important to align that with where you want to see the job postings going forward. If you look at our report, we have an analysis there, and I think it's the chart that I have shown here, and I can bring it back and here. And here, if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, when we talk about jobs, if we look at the job openings and the current employment by industry, right? So you have the job postings is on professional science and technical services. If you want to look at manufacturing, but that's not where a lot of the employment of Saudis are, right? So you need to, this mismatch needs to really be worked out to say, okay, what are the jobs in the future? What is the labor force that we have, and how can we improve both the quality but get also the right people? And by the way, we have here, STEM, and of course, when you want to certain of those industries, you have high quality capital. But if you want to also expand, in tourism, and if you want, more people in some of those industries, maybe, you might also need to complement that actually with some vocational training so that people want to go and work into hotels and some of those. So there's I think a lot of these realignment of the curricula will be quite important going forward. As I said, to get the growth going and to get the labor, I think access to human capital and high quality is quite important.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mati, for your insightful presentation and thoughtful answers. We truly value the IMF's perspective and your engagement with us today. With this, we conclude this session. Once again, thank you very much, Mr. Mati.
Thank you very much for having me, and looking forward to further interaction. Thank you.
Thank you.
نشكر سعادة الدكتور سعيد آل الشيخ وضيفه على هذه الجلسة. Thank you, Dr. Saeed Al Sheikh, and your guests for this interesting and fruitful session. وصلنا إلى تلاوة البيان الختامي وأهم توصيات المؤتمر تقدمها سعادة الدكتورة ريم عبد الرحمن الشكيري، أمين مجلس إدارة جمعية الاقتصاد السعودية وعضو اللجنة العلمية للمؤتمر، فلتتفضل مشكورة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. برعاية كريمة من معالي وزير التعليم الأستاذ يوسف البنيان وبالتعاون مع جامعة الأعمال والتكنولوجيا بجدة، نختتم اليوم أعمال المؤتمر السنوي الثاني والعشرين لجمعية الاقتصاد السعودية، والذي جاء بعنوان الآثار الاقتصادية لتحولات المعاصرة آفاق وتطلعات. وقد ناقش المؤتمر عبر جلساته العلمية والحوارية 5 محاور رئيسية تمس مستقبل الاقتصاد الوطني والعالمي، وهي أولاً، تحولات الطاقة والاستدامة الاقتصادية. ثانياً، الذكاء الاصطناعي والقوى العاملة. ثالثاً، تطورات الخدمات اللوجستية وانعكاساتها على التجارة العالمية. رابعاً، التطور الابتكاري في مجال البيئة. خامساً، المصادر الطبيعية والأمن الغذائي. استعرض في المؤتمر عدد من الأوراق البحثية المحكمة وأوراق العمل التي تركزت حول محاور المؤتمر وتضمنت نتائج وتوصيات علمية وسياسات عامة. ندعو الباحثين والمهتمين للاطلاع عليها. وقد نشرت تلك البحوث المحكمة وأوراق العمل في عدد خاص من مجلة الدراسات الاقتصادية التي تصدر عن جمعية الاقتصاد السعودية. وفيما يلي نقدم لكم أبرز ما خلص إليه المؤتمر من توصيات بحثية وعلمية. إجراء دراسات مقارنة موسعة لمشاريع الطاقة المتجددة في المملكة العربية السعودية مقارنة بتجارب عالمية. تشجيع البحوث المهتمة بنماذج حساب الأثر الاقتصادي الكلي، مثل قياس أثر المشاريع على الناتج المحلي الإجمالي، خلق الوظائف ودور الطاقة المتجددة في تنويع الاقتصاد. دراسة الأبعاد الاجتماعية لتحولات الطاقة وأثرها على المجتمعات المحلية. دراسة اندماج تقنيات الذكاء الاصطناعي في إدارة الطاقة وتنبؤ الطلب. إجراء دراسات كمية لقياس أثر المعايير البيئية والاجتماعية والحوكمة ESG على الاستقرار المالي للشركات. تطوير أبحاث مقارنة حول كفاءة التمويل الأخضر وأسواقه الناشئة. إجراء أبحاث متقدمة حول أثر اللوجستيات الذكية والتحول الرقمي على النمو الاقتصادي. إجراء أبحاث متقدمة في تطبيقات الذكاء الاصطناعي بسوق العمل. إجراء المزيد من الدراسات حول أثر شيخوخة السكان على النمو الاقتصادي. تقييم سياسات الانفتاح التجاري باستخدام نماذج قياسية متقدمة. تعزيز الدراسات التجريبية في مجال الاقتصاد والقانون. وإجراء دراسات تطبيقية في تقنيات الاستزراع السمكي الحديثة وقياس أثر الاستزراع السمكي على الأمن الغذائي واستدامة الموارد البيئية المائية. كما انبثق من المؤتمر مجموعة من التوصيات الإجرائية والمتعلقة بالسياسة العامة، وهي كما يلي: في مجال الطاقة والاستدامة، الدعوة إلى تسريع الاستثمار في مشاريع الطاقة المتجددة وتعزيز الشراكة بين القطاعين العام والخاص، ودعم البحث والتطوير في تقنيات التخزين والشبكات الذكية، مع التركيز على الاقتصاد الدائري الكربوني والحد من الانبعاثات الصناعية، والدعوة إلى إرساء إطار تنظيمي وتشريعي واضح ومستقر. في مجال الاستدامة المالية والحوكمة، الدعوة إلى إنشاء المرصد السعودي للاستدامة والحوكمة ليكون منصة داعمة وممكنة للشركات السعودية في تبني وتطبيق المعايير البيئية والاجتماعية والحوكمة ESG، بما يسهم في تعزيز جاذبيتها للتمويل الأخضر وتلبية متطلبات الاستدامة. كما تم التأكيد على أهمية موائمة التشريعات الاقتصادية والمالية مع متطلبات الاستدامة لضمان تحقيق أثر فعال ومستدام. في مجال الخدمات اللوجستية والتجارة، الدعوة إلى التركيز على تطوير البنية التحتية والخدمات اللوجستية الذكية، بما يسهم في رفع تنافسية الاقتصاد السعودي وتعزيز اندماجه في الاقتصاد العالمي. والتأكيد على أهمية وضرورة استكمال منظومة السكك الحديدية لربط كافة مدن المملكة، وإعطاء الأولوية لبرنامج تطوير الصناعة الوطنية والخدمات اللوجستية لشبكة السكك الحديدية لفتح مسارات جديدة لنقل السلع والبضائع والأفراد. في مجال القوى العاملة والذكاء الاصطناعي، الدعوة إلى إطلاق برامج تعليمية وتدريبية نوعية وتأهيل المواطن الرقمي، وإجراء أبحاث متقدمة لدعم استخدام الذكاء الاصطناعي في سوق العمل والخدمات الحكومية. في مجال الابتكار والتقنية، الدعوة إلى زيادة الإنفاق على البحث والتطوير وتحفيز القطاع الخاص على الابتكار وريادة الأعمال التقنية، وتعزيز الشراكة الدولية لنقل المعرفة وتوطين التقنية وربط الابتكار بأهداف التنمية المستدامة. في مجال السياسات الاقتصادية الكلية، الدعوة إلى تعزيز مشاركة الفئات السكانية كافة في النشاط الاقتصادي والاستثمار في رأس المال البشري والسيطرة على معدلات التضخم وتسريع وتيرة الانفتاح التجاري. في مجال الأمن الغذائي والموارد الطبيعية، الدعوة إلى تعزيز الاستثمار في الاستزراع السمكي بالأنظمة الحديثة وتقليل الاعتماد على الخارج، بما يدعم الأمن الغذائي الوطني ويحقق الاستغلال الأمثل للموارد. إن جمعية الاقتصاد تعرب عن اعتزازها بما تحقق في هذا المؤتمر من إثراء معرفي وحوارات علمية رصينة، فإنها تؤكد أن هذه المخرجات والتوصيات العلمية والعملية تمثل إضافة نوعية تدعم صانعي القرار وتسهم في تحقيق مستهدفات رؤية المملكة 2030 نحو اقتصاد متنوع ومستدام قادر على مواجهة التحديات واستثمار الفرص. وفي الختام تتوجه الجمعية بخالص الشكر والتقدير لمعالي وزير التعليم ولجامعة الأعمال والتكنولوجيا ولسعادة رئيس مجلس أمناء الجامعة الدكتور عبد الله دحلان على دعوته الكريمة، ولجميع الباحثين والمشاركين والداعمين وأعضاء اللجان المختلفة والمنظمين الذين أسهموا في إنجاح هذا المؤتمر، سائلين الله أن يبارك الجهود وأن يوفق الجميع لما فيه خير الوطن وازدهاره. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نشكر الدكتورة ريما شقري على كلمتها. وما أجمل أن يتوج العطاء باحتفاء. نبدأ مراسم التكريم. ندعو سعادة عميدة البحث العلمي الدكتورة رؤى عمر بن صديق وسعادة الأستاذ الدكتور أحمد المحيميد رئيس جمعية الاقتصاد السعودية للتفضل لبدء التكريم. قائمة المكرمين: الدكتور أحمد ناصر الراجحي رئيس جلسة بحثية بعنوان تحولات الطاقة. الدكتور أيمن محمد زعربان رئيس جلسة بحثية بعنوان التطور الابتكاري في مجال البيئة. الدكتور ممدوح عبد العزيز الفريان رئيس جلسة بحثية بعنوان الذكاء الاصطناعي والقوى العاملة. الدكتور عبد المحسن صالح آل الشيخ في جلستين: رئيس جلسة بحثية بعنوان المصادر الطبيعية والأمن الغذائي، ورئيس جلسة بحثية بعنوان تطورات الخدمات اللوجستية وانعكاساتها على التجارة العالمية. الدكتور طلال حمد السبهان رئيس جلسة ورقات العمل. والآن مع تكريم المشاركين ببحث علمي، الأستاذ محمد الصادق الحاج. الدكتور ريان سالم حماد. الدكتور علي اليافعي. الدكتورة فاطمة أحمد محمد. الدكتور الوليد نور الهدى كنة. الأستاذ منصور عبد العزيز العبيد. الدكتورة سناء نسيم أحمد. الأستاذ الدكتور بشير أحمد العبد الرزاق. المشاركين بورقة عمل: الدكتور ياسر علي المالكي، الدكتورة غادة عثمان السيد. الأستاذة الدكتورة نورة عبد الرحمن اليوسف. الدكتور عبد الله محمد المالكي، عضو مجلس إدارة جمعية الاقتصاد السعودية. منسقين ومنظمين المؤتمر: الأستاذ الدكتور علي محمد الرشيدي، الدكتور علي طاهر اليافعي، الدكتور محمد أحمد كنعان، قائمة منظمين المؤتمر: الأستاذة هديل محمد آل ثنيان، الأستاذة غيداء رفيق الجارودي، الأستاذ محمد عقيل عنقاوي، الأستاذ محمد علي محمد، الأستاذ عبد الرحمن صالح الماجد. الأستاذ عبد المجيد محمد الحسن. إدارة الخدمات المساندة ويستلمها بالنيابة الأستاذ نزيه مكوار. إدارة التسويق وتستلمها الأستاذة نجود الشريف. إدارة تقنية المعلومات ويستلمها الأستاذ صدام فتح. إدارة العلاقات العامة ويستلمها الأستاذ نزيه مكوار. عمادة شؤون الطلاب ويستلمها الأستاذ حسام رحيم. إدارة المرافق والخدمات ويستلمها الأستاذ فهد عبد الجواد. وفي ختام هذا المؤتمر نشكركم مجددا على تلبية الدعوة، ونشكر كل من عمل على إنجاح هذا المؤتمر، ونسأل الله أن يكون هذا المؤتمر نواة لتطور الأبحاث الاقتصادية لدفع عجلة التنمية ولتحقيق مستهدفات رؤية المملكة 2030. تشرفت بتقديم المؤتمر، كانت معكم الدكتورة والإعلامية هبة جمال، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.